Welcome to this podcast series from the School of Teacher Education at Charles Sturt University, Australia. Good morning, podcast listeners. Yes, we're joining you on another glorious Sunday morning in Bathurst, and we're looking over the Blue Mountains in our front room, and it is my pleasure once more to be talking with Steve Redhead. And again, today we're also talking about doctoral education, but we're extending that conversation a little bit more, and I'll tell you why. I have a wonderful PhD student in my School of Teacher Education at Charles Sturt University, and his name is Nick Riddell. He's not our student, but he teaches in our department and he's completing a doctorate. He knows Steve very well. They appear to get together and discuss a lot of progressive music. I don't think it's got to Pentangle, but it's got very close to Pentangle, podcast listeners, so be afraid. But he's a great guy. He arrives early every morning, I arrive early every morning, and we talk a great deal in and around the photocopier. And Nick asked me a series of questions about how you do develop the CV up, how you do create the post-doctoral career even when you're in the latter stages of a PhD. And I think Nick's really in the last year, 18 months or so. So he is thinking about the future and what that CV would look like. And he asked that Steve and I would do a podcast on that. And we are thrilled to do so. And there is no doubt, I think, that the career planning for PhD students to develop the career and develop the CV is very much undercooked, I think, in doctoral educations, not only in Australia, but also, I think, around the world. So that's what this podcast is about. So, Steve, good morning, good sir.
Good morning.
And the first question really is about speed, which, of course, with your Varillion expertise, is one of your tropes of interest. But how important is finishing the thesis as quickly as possible? So not delaying, not adding that extra semester, that extra couple of months. How important is it to finish it, to get it in, get it examined, and move on with your life?
Well, I do think speed is of the essence. I actually think a lot of the time what's happening to PhD students is that there are distractions put in their way, and sometimes they're putting distractions in their way to stop them finishing.
Yeah.
Certainly, I would say that PhD thesis is the thing.
Is the thing.
The other things actually, in general, don't matter.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't help PhD students with writing articles or getting administrative or teaching experience, but the PhD is the thing. And getting that finished to a standard is actually what matters. So I do think finishing, the question you asked, finishing the thing quickly is actually of the essence, because a lot of the time in that late period, that's the time that troubles arise, actually. It's odd, but you start to get to a point where you don't want to give in the thesis. You know quite a lot about it, so you are more critical, and therefore you don't finish. So I would say finish. Absolutely finish first. And also with all these other things, these other distractions in the background.
Yes, and a few things to say about that. The research demonstrates the longer a thesis takes, the less likely it is to be completed. So if you can get it in, out, shake it all about, you've got a real chance of finishing it. But the second thing, in terms of you and I as people who employ early career researchers, if I see that a staff member, a student, a prospective staff member has completed a thesis in 3 years or 3.5 years, I think that's fantastic. They can start, they can finish, they're demonstrating a respect of time zones and timelines and milestones. That's terrific. If I start to see a doctorate, and I'm not talking part-time doing it while you're an academic, but if I start to see it clicking to 4 years and 4.5 and 5, that starts to become a deal breaker, because that demonstrates an inability to complete a task in a timely fashion. Have I been too hard there?
I think you are pretty hard about that, but I do think it's so important that we have to make sure that that students finish as quickly as they can.
Yeah, and also, of course, if you have got empirical data, and you and I tend to be theorists and have theoretical doctoral students with us, but of course empirical data dates quickly. So, you often see students these days talking about data from 2006, 2007, 2008, and it's starting to look a bit tired and problematic as well. So always be aware of that lag with empirical data too.
But I also think we're trying to do this to help people with their careers. I actually think that because the whole thing is now so competitive, that if you go to an interview, and this is happening all the time, or you go for a promotion or whatever it is, with the PhD pending, a lot of the time either people don't finish or they don't finish for a very long time, and actually it's a spruik. You say, I'm nearly at the end of my PhD. Well, every time anybody says that, I'm sceptical.
Yes, I go blank. Whenever I'm nearly done. Are you? And I just go blank, because I've seen so many people, you have as well, look, I'm nearly finished, and the nearly ends up being 18 months.
Or never finishing.
Or never finishing. So that's why the end point, the submission, really matters. So thank you for that, Steve. But we should also talk about the other crucial variable that's integral to the CV and to the future career for doctoral students, and that is teaching. Why teaching matters so much is that these scholars are going into lectureship positions in the UK or A and B level lectureship posts in Australia. These are teaching heavy posts. So if they are going to get these first jobs, they are going to be teaching. Now that's crucial. You've got to really get that into your skull, that you really, how you're going to demonstrate is, yes, you need a PhD. That's almost taken for granted these days. You're going to get it on the basis of your teaching. So what do you recommend to the PhD students in terms of developing the teaching bit of their CV?
Well, I think they need to do it as they're going along. That's not something that they can just key into right at the end, which really does distract them from finishing the PhD.
Indeed.
So I think it's the ones that I've certainly supervised recently who've done well in this sort of area have balanced the PhD work with teaching at a reasonable level and a reasonable amount of teaching pretty early on. So I think to plan it as you're going along with your PhD is a really good idea.
Yeah, and so we did a lot of work at Murdoch, and I developed sort of the framework in which we could actually systematically engage teaching that had the maximum bang for the buck for the student with the minimal disruption to their doctorate. Because that's what we're talking about. And what that means is right the way through the PhD, so perhaps in the first session you start as a marker. Then you're moving into doing some tute work, perhaps some forum management. See, for me, the important thing is what bases have to be covered. Right. Well, by the end of the 3 years, they have to have demonstrated an ability to mark, to moderate, to teach in a tutorial seminar, to lecture, to be able to online manage a forum, manage all sorts of online marking, manage Turnitin, and also, and this is really important, go through the levels.
Yes.
So you've got to be able to have taught at first year level, so the guys and gals straight off the street, you have to be able to handle them because that's the work you're going to be doing.
That's right.
But also right up to honours if you can. So really start to work throughout the levels, online and offline, that's crucial. And also the capacity to work in a teaching team is really important. So
all of those things.
So you're going to have to do that. So they need to see that on the CV. So every time you learn something new, you do something new in teaching, put that on your CV.
Yeah.
Very important. Now, we've already covered, the doctorate and the teaching. That's the important stuff. But again, the way in which you enhance yourself and you make yourself different, I would argue, is through administration. Now, let me try and explain what I mean. Administration is really often underplayed, I think, for doctoral students. But being able to be part of a department, a good colleague, part of a department, part of a school is crucial. So it is important that you demonstrate the capacity to fill in forms, to go through moderation protocols in a career. And how important do you think this is, Steve, and particularly roles like a postgraduate rep on a committee, say?
Yeah, I think that is really important. And also I think if you can get involved in, the research clusters.
Yes.
Sometimes those things can be counterproductive, but I actually do think that helps so that you are involved in research meetings, for example, within the school. So you're not an isolated postgraduate student. And actually, postgrad rep is a really good good part of that. But I think there are various ways that you can get involved.
And so, for example, Steve, in SOAT and a lot of the departments we've been in, there is a weekly seminar that's on Monday at 1 o'clock. Of podcast listeners know this because we podcast them as well. But how important is it that the research students are part of that and that's on their CV?
Crucial, in my view. Absolutely. That's partly becoming an academic colleague anyway. But also they should be part of that because they're learning how to present. You know, you can never get enough of that. And also learn how not to present, you know. And I actually think that those sorts of attendances are really important.
Yeah. And also ask your head of department, ask your head of school, if your seminar series is not being recorded and released publicly, ask them to do it, because all these links, of course, are permanent links and can go on your CV. So we've had, for example, James, a wonderful one of our PhD students, deliver a presentation. I then edited that up. It's on as a podcast. And for the rest of his career, from 2015, there will be this sonic file so people can actually hear him present, assess his communication skills, assess his capacity to answer questions. So, you know, really they almost don't have to interview him because they've heard how he performs publicly.
Yeah, it's vital. And I think that, I mean, there's seminars are a really good example. And people's ability even to ask questions in those seminars is very important.
Exactly.
So I do think that's showing it's showing their skills in all sorts of ways, but it's also improving their skills and getting them related to other people in the department, which is what you were asking. I do think that's very important. And then people say, "Oh, it's that PhD student did really well there. Let's get them involved in other things."
He asked a key question to this person. Oh, look, he's interested in that. Let's bring this person in. Never underestimate that. And of course, we've talked about the wider school or departmental environment. How important, Steve, is it to get to know your head of school? So you're a PhD student. There's sort of this scary person. Oh, yes, heads of school are so scary. The scary person in an office with power, and you think, oh, I'm a lowly PhD student. How important is it that you go into that office and you get to know that person and they get to know you?
Well, I think that is really important. I mean, when I was a PhD student, I would never have done that. I would have been scared to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that was really bad.
Yeah.
So I think you can benefit in all sorts of ways there. It's two ways. You can hopefully get references for your future anyway, but also you're learning from the person who's running the department and has all sorts of links with other people, both in the university and outside the university. So you cannot but benefit.
And it provides a wider context outside of the supervisors too, because the nature of PhD, and when we started, is it can be quite insular, and you have these intensely intimate relationships with a couple of people.
Yes.
So it is important, I think, that you actually get some alternative views, perspectives, and a wider sense of what's going on in the academy.
Yeah, very much so. And I just think, you learn to be an academic colleague.
Yeah.
And that's how you do it. You learn it through the experience of becoming involved in research clusters or seminars or whatever.
Yeah, now a lot of what we've talked about has been about visibility. So you're a PhD student. How can you get above the parapet? How can you be visible? How can people even know that you exist? So how can PhD students be visible in a department, in a university and beyond? And obviously this is really the social media area, I think.
I think it is. And the more people can get involved in, Twitter, Facebook, etc., then the better, in my view. That is certainly something that will allow them to communicate with people from within the university, but from without as well. And I think the idea also of giving seminars themselves, that's one of the things we didn't say before. I actually do think, that seems such an obvious thing to say, but you should be doing that as a PhD student and showing how you're developing.
Yeah. Yeah, because, you could be spending thousands of dollars and going to a conference, or you could actually just go downstairs once a semester and deliver a seminar that's podcasted and tens of thousands of people hear it.
Yeah.
So, that for me is incredibly important. I remember when I showed your PhD student, Ian, and big love to Ian. Where's Ian at the moment?
He's in Toronto.
He's back in Toronto.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Ian. I remember when I showed Ian academia.edu, he said, look, I don't really do social media. And then he came into my office and we put it up on the two screens and, we showed him things like, papers that are on academia.edu have a 75% higher citation rate, and showed him how to search it and profile. And his head exploded. He started off saying, oh, look, I might do this. And by the end of it, he said, look, I'll have my profile up in 15 minutes.
Yeah. Yes, he was very, very, not taking into that, but understandably, I would have been exactly the same. He was very guarded about his privacy, and he always felt that.
True.
And he really didn't want to do this.
Yeah.
But he's now engaged himself in social media that so much, he's on Facebook much more than I am, for example. So.
But where Ian is right is you've got to mitigate and manage that relationship between privacy and visibility, but also for a PhD student, if you want a job, you have to be visible.
Yeah.
So perhaps you have to mortgage some of that privacy to perform a self that can get a job.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, his involvement in academia.edu has enabled him to get to a point where he's going to get a postdoc in Canada. And I just think, 2 years ago he wouldn't have appreciated that was going to be a possibility, but it was all to do with social media. You have to have a good profile to put on there.
And supervisors with a name that can help you and prepare
That's
you.
right. But in fact, that aspect of social media, which we don't often talk about, is absolutely vital. He wouldn't now be in the position he is in without that.
No, fantastic. And look, great introduction. It's almost as if we're married, Steve. You mentioned Ian, and it looks like we've got everything crossed, but it looks like a great postdoc is available for him. So for podcast listeners, Ian did his PhD in the Central West, in the middle of New South Wales. He's a Canadian citizen and just went back and, is about to submit. When we say about to submit, I think
in March.
He actually is March, so that's fantastic. And I think I'm doing a mock exam for him as well to just frighten him. And Ian, don't you think I've forgotten, Ian? I'm doing your oral exam, mate. His mock oral exam anyway. Then he's going out into the world. But you've talked about a postdoctoral program. We haven't mentioned that, and I haven't mentioned it for many reasons because I have a series of biases against postdoctoral programs. What's your perspective on these types of postdoctoral frameworks, because they're big at the moment?
They are. I don't have anything against them. I don't, the one we're talking about, Ian's talking about, is a SHRC one, Social Science Humanities Research Council money. If you can get involved in those things, get involved in them, is my view. I think the only thing I would say is that what we said before, really, that the PhD is so important, you have to get that, and you have to then move on. You do things with your PhD, but that may be in, as we've often said, writing a number of articles or even a monograph based on it. But you have to move on from the PhD, and sometimes that's quite difficult. And even moving on from your supervisors.
That's it.
So if the postdoc involved, in Ian's case, it was with other people, new people in Canada. But actually, I think there is a danger there in that you become an internal PhD student. And my argument really...
Eternal. I'll just translate that into outside of...
Forever.
Yeah.
And I do think that's a danger. And I've seen that over my career, certainly, where people did get stuck in that space and never got out of it.
No, that's what's worried me. I've seen it time and time again, and I think that's why I am against them. I think in Ian's case, it's tremendous and terrific. But what I have seen throughout my entire career, it's not just an Australian thing, it can be international as well, that someone does a PhD, often sort of in... as a satellite of the PhD supervisor's research, and then they finish that, and then a postdoc happens again in sort of the orbit of the PhD supervisor's work. And the other thing I would say is they're then not teaching, they're not developing the big teaching profile, so they're running their own large first-year course, and of course and they're just doing bits and pieces of teaching, they're not developing that bit of their CV. So when the postdoc finishes, they may have 8 or 9 articles, which again they would have got anyway if they'd had a teaching research job, to be honest with you, but I won't say that. So they haven't really done the big teaching, and the teaching is what gets you your first, second, third and fourth job.
It is, but take Ian, for example, he did really good teaching experience.
He did.
He did all of the other things. He did joint articles with his supervisors, which were published and are excellent. Yeah. He is, just take him for example, that area that he worked in is quite a fledgling area. So sports officiating studies which come from communication studies and sports studies.
Yes.
It is quite a new international area, and you can bring in interdisciplinary approaches, socio-legal approaches, and so on. But actually, because he, my advice to him certainly was to try and get the PhD done and then become one of the go-to people for that sort of area. And he found that going to international conferences that actually that was very useful, and he was one of these people.
Yeah.
And that's the follow-on with the postdoc. So I think if it's an area which is developing like that, then maybe you should go for it, even if it means putting off a bit of the teaching.
Yes.
So I think it partly, it partly depends on the sort of area.
I agree with that, but also I think we are raising these caveats
Yeah.
for a reason. If you're about to think, oh, look, a postdoc, this will be great, I can focus on my research for 3 years. That's great. Say you get 10, 15 articles out. Well, while you're a teaching researcher, you may have got 10 or 15 articles out, or certainly 8, to be frank with you. So you've got to work out what is going to get you a job. And as a head of school, and I'm a bit staunch on this, the money is made, the budgets are balanced by the teaching, not the research. In many universities, and I'm not saying research isn't important, without the research it's not a university, so you'll never get that argument from me. But in terms of a head of school's budget, when we're making an appointment, I want someone who is an excellent teacher, who can teach a diversity of areas and whose student evaluations are outstanding. For me, that is what I'm after. Postdoc, not bothered one way or the other. I'm interested in the publications they've produced, and I'm interested in their teaching.
I still think it's a question of balance. I think you don't I wouldn't relegate the postdoc, especially in the sort of areas that I'm talking about, where the actual area of the subject of study is being developed by working in a postdoc space.
Yes, you've convinced me of that, absolutely. But what I would say to guys and gals is, if you're thinking I'm just going to stay in the same department and work with the same people, I'd almost say, you know what, team, don't do that.
No.
That's not value adding to the CV.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah. Final bit of advice I would offer everybody is this. This is about collegiality. I always think higher education is about citizenship, it's about service, it's about contributing to the planet. That's what we do. But there should be a little bit of selfishness, I think, in a PhD student, because obviously, they're dealing with people who have tenured jobs often, and so they've got nothing to lose. You've got everything to lose. So always be aware when you're about to say yes to something. Ask yourself this question, team. Will this, whether it's teaching or research or administration, will this thing add a line to my CV? And if that thing, that committee, that moderation does not add a line to your CV, then start to say no. Be selfish. As Steve said, focus on the thesis. If it adds a line to your CV, then say yes. Are you happy with that advice, Steve?
I agree with that.
Fantastic. So, guys, I hope this was useful. And, Nick, every respect to you. Yes, keep listening to that bloody Pentangle or whatever the hell you two talk about.
King Crimson.
Yeah, King Crimson. But doesn't he like sort of the weird, folky, rocky stuff?
Yes, but we were talking about King Crimson.
I think he's writing on King Crimson at the moment, isn't he?
Yes.
And can I just, as a great example, that's a weird way to finish, of course. I'm producing a book called What Would Brian Eno Do? And of course, and Nick is working on science education in Australia, but his head of school is producing this book at the moment on sound and sonic media, and so he's actually producing a chapter for me on King Crimson. So, as a head of school, this is, so that relationship has helped him because he gets a book chapter, but also it demonstrates his capacity to not only teach science education, but have some expertise in sound and music
and
education.
popular culture.
Fantastic. So I hope this has been useful to you, Nick. Every respect, you're handsome. And we wish you well, and all the PhD students out there. Keep trucking away, team. It matters. One line at a time of your CV is going to make the difference. And if Steve and I can help you, absolutely feel free to contact us via Twitter, via Facebook, via LinkedIn, via academia.edu, or indeed via email at Charles Sturt University. Take care, guys. Look after yourselves.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from the School of Teacher Education at Charles Sturt University. For more information about our teaching, our research and our courses, please refer to www.csu.edu.au.